In this video, I want to talk about the problem of atheistic fundamentalism, indoctrination without religion. Now, of course, to some people, the very idea of atheistic fundamentalism will sound like an oxymoron. But as I hope to establish quite quickly, that in itself is indicative of the very problem that I want to address. So I want to begin by laying out a framework for the concept of indoctrination. And now indoctrination contrasts with education in that you could sort of illustrate it with the old story of teaching a person how to fish versus giving them a fish. Well, indoctrination, rather than teaching you how to think, it tells you what to think. And indoctrination, as a result, limits your thinking, your critical abilities of reflection, and your ability to discover and learn new information. And I want to summarize the process of indoctrination in 3 steps. So the first step is the process of limiting your critical thought. Here, the idea is that one develops an inability to think critically about certain core ideological beliefs, because these beliefs are deemed off limits from critical introspective analysis. In other words, the way that the system is set up, you are prevented from thinking critically about certain fundamental core commitments that you have. Second thing that happens is an absolute binary opposition. So here the idea is that these core beliefs, the ones that are protected from introspective analysis, that typically occurs by way of an invocation or appeal to an absolute binary opposition, one that distinguishes between truth and error in an unqualified absolute sense, or right and wrong, or good and evil, such that everybody on the one side of the ideological wall is in truth, right, and good, and everybody on the other side of the this binary wall of indoctrination is on error, wrong, and evil. So the ideology gets protected by way of the binary walls that one constructs. And finally, the very willingness to accept the binary opposition and thus the set of core ideological beliefs which are protected from critical introspective analysis. This occurs by way of the propagation or perception of a sense of crisis which requires us to erect the walls in order to protect the ideological beliefs. Here, the idea is that the resistance to binary opposites, which we might typically have, so, we might typically say, well, you know what, this black and white, right or wrong, good or evil, it's more nuanced than that. There's more gray in the world. You might typically think that way, but you are less likely to think that way if you perceive a crisis which requires you to retreat to simple oppositions. And so your resistance to binary opposites, which typically protect core ideological beliefs, it is quickly lowered if we sense an imminent crisis. So we are more likely to accept binary oppositions, which are in other cases more obviously untenable, if we sense a crisis. There's a great moment in the film Flags of Our Fathers, which was directed by Clint Eastwood. And in the film, it's set in World War II, and it's based on the famous image of the flag racing at Mount Iwo Jima on, I believe it's Mount Suribachi. And so the American Marines, they raised the flag and they took a photo of it, and it was actually a staged photo. And they wanted to then use it as a propaganda piece to raise money for war bonds to fuel the war effort. And at one point, one of the soldiers who's involved in the fundraising, because they recognize that a lot of what's going on is not truth-telling, it's an absolute binary opposition between good and evil. And that's what you need in order to sell the war, is Americans good, Japanese bad, right? Or the Allied powers good, Axis powers evil. And that's how you win wars. And so one of the soldiers says, we need simple truths and damn few words. In other words, don't give me all the nuance of reality. Just tell me who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And those kinds of absolute binary oppositions are forced through. We become more likely to accept them if we have a sense of crisis. Okay, so that's the basic idea of indoctrination. Now I want to look and trace these 3 aspects in some contemporary atheist thought. And I want to stress here that I'm not talking about all atheists by any means. That would be absurd. I mean, that would be showing that I have the very problem that I'm critiquing in others. But rather what I'm identifying is that some well-known atheists, some popular atheists evince this kind, or they reflect or demonstrate or propagate this kind of indoctrinational thinking and fundamentalism. So the first is limiting critical thought. Here I want to begin with the idea of atheism and its relationship to ideology. There's a very popular claim among many atheists today that atheists cannot be indoctrinated because atheists this is simply a denial of something, or a withholding of belief about something, that there is no unified ideology, there is no institution, there's no revelation or holy book, and because there's no magisterium or official teaching authority of atheists, and because you don't have any of those things, so the claim goes, you cannot be indoctrinated. But the reality is, and here I'm going to quote myself from my book, You're Not as Crazy as I Think. I say, what is necessary for indoctrination is not a magisterium, in other words, an official teaching authority, or a sacred text, but simply a set of teachings that inhibit critical thought. So a set of practices that propagate those teachings and inhibit your critical thinking. In fact, the irony is this: the lack of formal institution among atheists, as such as they say, or the lack of an official creed or officially designated leader may cultivate a false sense of autonomy that I form my own beliefs without any external influence. And that false sense of autonomy could render one even more liable or vulnerable to indoctrination than they were otherwise. So the danger of some of the so-called free thinkers, and I'll come back to that idea of people describing themselves, fancying themselves as free thinkers, is that they've wooed themselves into the false sense of security that they are a free thinker, they are autonomously deciding what they believe to be true, when in fact they are being shaped by deeply powerful social forces, which for all intents and purposes do function as a de facto magisterium, and a de facto set of unquestioned authorities, a de facto set of sacred texts or authoritative writings, which are forming and influencing at a deep level the way that these individuals think, and thus they are even more liable to indoctrination than they might have been had they had a recognition, a self-awareness of what their official magisterium or sacred texts or authorities were. So let's look at some examples of limiting critical thought. I want to begin here with a quote from Sam Harris, a very well-known atheist. He says, "Atheism is not a philosophy." And I've highlighted this here. He says, "It is not even a view of the world. It is simply an admission of the obvious." In fact, atheism is a term that should not even exist. No one ever needs to define himself as a non-astrologer or a non-alchemist. We do not have words for people who doubt that Elvis is still alive, or that aliens have traversed the galaxy only to molest ranchers and their cattle. Atheism is nothing more than the noises reasonable people make in the presence of unjustified religious beliefs. So the way that Harris has defined atheism here, it is notable. It is simply an admission of the obvious. If you are an atheist, then you recognize simply that which is obvious. If you are a non-atheist, then you have failed to recognize that which is obvious. Now, it should be obvious to us that what Harris is doing here is simply setting up a limiting of critical thought. He's setting up that binary opposition and limiting your critical thought so you cannot begin to think critically about the ideological commitments you have as an atheist because it's been simply defined as the obvious. Here's another example. This comes from David Mills in his book, Atheist Universe. He says, "Atheists have no obligation to prove or disprove anything." And then he argues it like this: "Otherwise, if you demand belief in all beings for which there is no absolute disproof, then you are forced by your own twisted logic to believe in mile-long pink elephants on Pluto, since at present we haven't explored Pluto and shown them to be non-existent." I'm sorry to say that Mr. Mills's reasoning here is very itself is the twisted logic. If we want to talk about twisted logic, nobody is claiming that one must demand belief in all beings for which there's no absolute disproof. This is simply a non sequitur. it's also a shifting of the goalposts. He's now shifting the very nature of what is being charged. But the fundamental issue here is that atheism is a claim about, well, typically it is a claim about something. And so what is the claim? Well, let's take a look first at what Mills is saying. He says atheism is the state of being without belief in God, that's all it is. And we do not defend being without belief in unicorns or Santa Claus. So he says, likewise, we should not need to defend being without belief in God. Now, that's the most charitable thing I can say, is to reconstruct his reasoning like this. And I'm not going to begin to engage with his absurd, a nonsensical claim that there would be an ontological explosion, that we must recognize every being for which there's no evidence. Let's just focus on this argument such as I've laid it out here, and I'll just offer a quick response to it. So here's my reply. First of all, I actually do believe that Santa Claus does not exist. I believe unicorns do not exist. It is not the case that I'm simply without belief in these things, but I positively believe they do not exist, although I cannot, of course, speak for Mr. Mills and his perception, but I suspect most adults in the West believe that Santa and unicorns do not exist. But here's the thing, next one, if there were rational adults who believed in Santa Claus or who believed in unicorns, then we would be obliged to offer a rational response to those individuals. And I would simply say there clearly is evidence for God. There clearly is evidence for rational adults who believe in God. So while there is no evidence for rational adults that I'm aware of who believe in Santa Claus or unicorns, in the case of God and Christianity, there certainly is, and thus there is an obligation for the person who wants to have a meaningful, rational engagement with those individuals to provide a response to their beliefs. So let's now just consider an example. This is Barbara Ehrenreich. She is a journalist and one that I quite respect. She's a very interesting thinker herself. But I want to quote here from one of her books, an autobiographical reflection that she wrote. And I think there's, as I read this passage, I think you'll see there's some self-awareness for her about the irony of the situation. So she was raised in what was understood to be a free thought home. And this is the way she puts it. I was raised in a real strong secular humanist family, the kind of folks who'd ground you for a week just for thinking of dating a Unitarian or worse. Not that they were hardliners, though. We had over 70 Bibles lying around the house where anyone could browse through them. Gideon's my dad had removed from the motel rooms he'd stayed in. And I remember how he gloried in every Gideon he lifted, thinking of all the traveling salesmen whose minds he probably saved from dry rot. Looking back, I guess you could say I never really had a choice, what with my parents always preaching, think for yourself, think for yourself. Now, this is a delightful passage to me because it shows Ehrenreich is well aware of the irony here, that her parents were saying, think for yourself, and yet by doing that and behaving in the way that they were, with this absolute attack on religious belief, almost, I mean, fanatical, right, to the extent of stealing Bibles from hotel rooms till he had over 70 Bibles. And then to say, think for yourself, well, they weren't helping her think for herself. They were trying to indoctrinate Barbara Ehrenreich into their own set of beliefs. And that, sadly, is what often happens with this first stage where you limit critical options. The way then, number two, that you limit those critical options, as I've said, is that you propagate an absolute binary opposition. So here's a very common way of cashing this out among people who are fundamentalist atheists in this way. That they think about atheism as being rational, autonomous, clear thinking, consistent, and unencumbered by dogma. There was an attempt 15 years ago or so to popularize the term bright for atheists, to describe atheists as brights, obviously in contrast to those who are not atheists and who are dark, and thus who do not recognize, as Sam Harris put it, quote, the obvious. So on the other hand, we have faith heads and fleas. So faith head, of course, is a term that Richard Dawkins coined for people who are essentially not atheists, who are religious. He also used this term flea for people who would provide critiques of him and his views. So it's, again, kind of quite a dismissive picture. So the faith heads are irrational. They are subjugated rather than being autonomous. They have cloudy thinking rather than clear thinking. They're inconsistent in their reasoning and their beset with cognitive bias, and they are encumbered by dogmas and tradition, by magisteria and religious texts of authority. So if you have that kind of contrast, it's no surprise that you will then come to think of atheism as this ideological commitment which is protected because of this absolute distinction. Anybody on the wrong side of the distinction is irrational, subjugated, etc. So then you get things like this t-shirt. I think, therefore I'm atheist. Okay. Here's some quotes reflecting the result of this kind of absolute binary opposition. So here's Richard Dawkins quoting Robert Pirsig. When one person suffers from a delusion, it is called insanity. When many people suffer from a delusion, it is called religion. So if you have this view that to be religious is to be insane, then that is a nice way of protecting the absolute binary opposition and the core ideological commitments. Sam Harris says, the history of Christian theology is the story of bookish men parsing a collective delusion. So an entire mode of discourse, centuries old, involving many of the greatest intellects in history, is merely parsing a collective delusion, and thus we can appropriately ignore and dismiss all of the contributions and insights and perspectives from that tradition and those individuals. Dawkins as well, of course, infamously refers to religion as a mind virus which co-opts and corrupts the mind of its host. So apparently his views are not a mind virus, but the views he disagrees with are. Some more examples from Dawkins. He refers to the ontological argument as infantile, so a 900-year-old family, in fact, of philosophical arguments which have been and continue to be defended by many leading philosophers. I will say the only thing that's infantile is calling a 900-year-old argument that is still seriously debated at the highest echelons of academic philosophy. Infantile, that's the only thing that's infantile, is dismissing it. Dawkins said, in defense of his own views in the second edition of The God Delusion, the notion that religion is a proper field in which one might claim expertise is one that should not go unquestioned. That clergymen presumably would not have deferred to the expertise of acclaimed fairyologist on the exact shape and color of fairy wings. So the idea that Dawkins is saying here is he doesn't have to have any knowledge of philosophy of religion, of biblical exegesis, of Christian history, of systematic theology, biblical theology, because none of these are proper fields in which one can claim expertise. He can simply, as an untutored layperson, propagate his own views and be able to thereby dismiss all of the academic musings of all the experts in these fields because it's not a proper field to begin with. He also says of his book, The God Delusion, I would happily have foregone bestsellerdom if there had been the slightest hope of Duns Scotus illuminating my central question of whether God exists. Now, Duns Scotus was a 13th century, I should say, 13th century, early 14th century scholastic theologian and philosopher, one of the great intellects of the Middle Ages, called the subtle doctor, because of the subtle philosophical and conceptual logical distinctions he would frequently make in his work. But of course, Dawkins doesn't have to worry about Duns Scotus because there is by definition no hope that Duns Scotus might illuminate the central question of whether God exists, because the whole topic of whether God exists or what positive reasons there are to believe in God is itself not apparently a proper field in which one might claim expertise. This is a great example of indoctrination and the limiting of critical options. Similarly, David Mills writes, nor in my opinion is it even possible to change the religious views of those who perceive themselves as ethically superior because they belong to the one true religion. Their ears and eyes and minds are closed forever. No amount of science or logic will make any difference to them. What an irony. I wonder what amount of science or logic will make any difference to David Mills in changing his views. Sam Harris says, the central tenet of every religious tradition is that all others are mere repositories of error, or at best, dangerously incomplete. Intolerance is thus intrinsic to every creed. Of course, this is false. Various religious traditions have various different views about the truth claims of their religion, about the nature of salvation, about the nature of interreligious dialogue and peaceable coexistence. But none of that matters if you have the absolute binary opposition that Harris has created here. He can simply dismiss all of them as themselves the repositories of error. Hitchens says religion comes from the period of human prehistory where nobody had the smallest idea of what was going on, and thus we can dismiss religion because they don't know what's going on. All attempts to reconcile faith with science and reason are consigned, and note the strong language here, to failure and ridicule. So the attempt to reconcile faith with science, to have a dialogue, to think how your particular beliefs interact in terms of metaphysics and ethics and so on, metaethics, how those beliefs interact with or might interact with natural science, that should be ridiculed. Think about that. Philosophical, careful reflection should be ridiculed. I mean, this is the language of fundamentalism at its barest. Finally, the sense of crisis. Naomi Klein, about 10 years ago, she wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine. And the shock doctrine, she argued in that book that when there is a time of social crisis, social upheaval, that often that is the time when radical economic reforms are pushed through in a particular society, which are much more advantageous to the rich and serve the interests of the rich. And so the rich will exploit social unrest and cultural crisis in order to push through economic reforms that usually would be resisted. And they do so to serve their own benefits and interests as the powerful. Well, I think that there's something similar going on for the fundamentalist often, that they appeal to something like a shock doctrine to propagate a sense of crisis in order to push through their absolute binary opposition and therefore indemnify and protect their core ideological commitments. And so the New Atheist, as an example, was a post 9/11 phenomenon, one which was born ironically by the fear of, quote, fundamentalism, spawning a wartime ethos. So the idea that, well, they're coming to get us, people from other religious groups, Muslims and so on, they're going to attack us, they're going to use violence, they're going to fly planes into buildings. And so we need to marshal our resources, to rally our resources, and to fight religion. And so this then justifies, this crisis justifies the otherwise bald and indefensible rhetoric that was used by the New Atheists. Dawkins then says, such hostility as I or other atheists occasionally voice towards religion is limited to words. I'm not going to bomb anybody, behead them, stone them, burn them at the stake, crucify them, or fly planes into their skyscrapers just because of a theological disagreement. So what he's saying here is our rhetoric is okay because of the nature of the threat that is posed toward us and the fact that, of course, we won't use violence, but only they will use violence. Interestingly, Daniel Dennett, in his book, Breaking the Spell, he says this about the research. Perhaps I should have devoted several more years to the study of religion before writing this book. But since the urgency of the message was borne in on me again and again by current events, I had to settle for the perspectives I had managed to achieve so far. I find that to be a very revealing statement. He could have taken a more critical, nuanced, introspective approach to religion and truth and discourse and philosophy of religion and so on. But the events of the day, current events, had created this crisis sense that we need to oppose religion, which required him to write the book quickly and get it out onto the market. The result of this kind of fundamentalism is that the non-religious or the atheist fundamentalist is often unable even to understand the very religious faith that they repudiate. And so they remain mystified by it, and that is because they have themselves been indoctrinated into their ideological commitments and their binary oppositions through the sense of crisis, and thus they just can't even understand those with whom they disagree. So Dawkins repeatedly says this in his writings and public statements. He says, I remain baffled, not so much by belief in a cosmic lawgiver of some kind, as by the Christian's belief in the details of the Christian religion, resurrection, forgiveness of sins and all. He's baffled by it. He can't understand how anybody could disagree with him on such matters. He says, I'm continually astonished by those theists who, far from having their consciousness raised in the way that I propose, seem to rejoice in natural selection as God's way of achieving his creation, So in other words, theists who don't accept his binary warfare model between Christianity and science, which says, well, either God created through six-day creation or it's atheistic naturalism. Anybody who doesn't buy into that, he's astonished by it. Once again, astonished because of his own critical thinking has been limited by his own ideological commitments. He says, why any circles worthy of the name of sophisticated remain within the church is a mystery, at least as deep as those that theologians enjoy. So once again, it is for him a deep mystery that anybody could disagree with him and his own atheistic, philosophical, and religious perspectives, which are deeply fundamentalist. He says the religiosity of today's America is something truly remarkable. Okay, so that is my quick synopsis introduction to atheistic fundamentalism. And the 3 steps, once again, to just summarize as we draw this to a close. First of all, a limiting of critical options. And you take certain ideological commitments and you place them beyond critical introspection or reflection or critique. Second, that you do that by the invocation or development or appeal of simple binary oppositions between the in-group and the out-group. And so anybody on the out-group it's viewed negatively, they're irrational, they're intellectually limited, stunted, maybe they're morally questionable. And your in-group includes the ideological commitments so that you don't question those or challenge those. And finally, you can often propagate this through the appeal to a sense of crisis, which spurs on in sort of shock doctrine manner, the fact that we need to have this simple warfare model of in-group and out-group in order to protect our belief community. Now, all of this material I've drawn from one chapter in my book, You're Not as Crazy as I Think, Dialogue in a World of Loud Voices and Hardened Opinions. And thank you for taking a look at atheistic fundamentalism.